Now it gets into the late season. I love this kind of hunting. I love snow, and I love hunting late season because it often can be, and that's point number one here, the best hunting of the entire season. And what I mean by that is there's so many lands and so many properties that have been overpressured and overhunted, and deer are pushed into areas and pinballed into areas, almost in the path of least resistance when it comes to hunting pressure. And you can find large numbers of deer. The remaining surviving bucks seem to group up together, herd up together in locations, in remote locations. And this also applies to public land. Someone said something about, really like some videos on public land. Well, the concepts are all the same. And I'm going to apply this video a little bit more to public land just to kind of illustrate that. My first book, my red book, I published in 2012. It talks about the whole movement of deer, the structure, the bedding to feeding, everything within that, and a little bit of hunting. And I talk about in the intro, I talk about a big buck coming in, one that I had shot, came in, talk about the whole setup. It's moving on these line of movements, moving from feeding way back into its bedding area. Talk about how I access that, perpendicular access. Talk about all the concepts that I teach and that I originated. And in the conclusion, I let folks know that that's a public land buck. And people buy that book thinking, well, this applies to my private land parcel, but really it applies to whitetails, and the concepts apply to whitetails anywhere they move, anywhere that you can hunt them. Anywhere a whitetail lives and whatever kind of whitetail habitat there is, the concepts still apply. And that's the same with this right here in finding late season bucks. I love hunting public land. And what's really cool about hunting during the late season in public land or on private, again, is that deer are pushed into a path of the least resistance. So they want to find those low risk areas. And point number two, the 2% rule. I want you to consider that less than 2% of all deer habitat is going to hold large herds of deer during the late season. I'm talking December into January, and some states even into early February. Well, we're experiencing a little bit of wind out here, and boy, it's really changing. You talk about late season. It's high of 47 degrees right now, which is warmer than it's been for a while, and it's supposed to be in some locations around here in the single digits tomorrow for highs. So it's really, really dropping. What's really cool about this time of year is that, you get to see large numbers. Less than 2% of the habitat holds deer. And you might think, well, that's hard. There's not a lot of locations where you can hunt deer. It almost makes it easier, because if you follow some of these other rules for how to find deer, then to me it's pretty easy to find deer during the late season. And guess what? You don't have a lot of competition. There's not a lot of other people out there hunting. So it's really weather dependent. We're waiting for a property right now. We have cell cameras out. We're waiting for deer to move onto it, because when it snows, we get deer into the conifers, and they come in there and they're really strong there for 2, 3, 4 days. We've known that for 15 years. So this time of year, you can easily find deer that are herded up, put the boot miles on, and consider that 2% rule. It's a good thing. You want to think that whether you're hunting public or private land, when you find the deer, you find great hunting. And again, you have no competition. Hidden pockets. Now, hidden pockets on public land. Public land, I'm looking for clear cuts, drastic change in habitat, whether it's wetland to hardwoods to clear cuts, elevation change. The more habitats in general, it doesn't matter for the entire season, but especially in the late season, deer are going to be where they have a lot of different habitats. They have to have daytime browse. In fact, on public land, by that time, you're really not hunting acorns or oaks or anything. They're all gone. You're hunting briar patches and clear cut patches. Deer will move a long ways to find those areas, and they're going to be hidden. They're not going to be right next to a parking area unless it's remote and people haven't been there for a month or two. But you're looking for areas, you're eliminating human pressure. You're eliminating those areas on public land within a half mile of traditional large parking areas where people are in and out. And so you're not only looking for that habitat where several different types of habitat comes together, and you have that daytime browse, you have enough stem count. What I mean by stem count, a switchgrass field has a lot of stem count. There's all those little stems. Regeneration of poplar is 7,000 shoots per acre. So there's a lot of stems, 7,000. Briar patch, lots of stems. The more stems, the more thermal protection you have. And so whether it's a conifer stand and you have all those branches and you have all those trunks, and it's diminishing the amount of wind and almost giving them a thermal protection, but you have to have that diversity. And so some of the conifer stands are loaded with sign deer in big storms, but then deer leave as soon as the weather clears, because there's no food, there's no regeneration. You don't have that quality stem count of actually briars, hard regeneration that they're feeding on. Those hidden pockets, once you look for good habitat and once you eliminate on public land, half mile to 3/4 of a mile from any main parking area where there's a lot of people in and out, you start to focus on areas that are not that common. You can even find that from the air. You can find the diversity of habitat. It's away from parking areas, it's away from roads, and you find that spot. I knew some spots down in Ohio, down in the hills down there on public land that were pretty good, and was interesting. There's some that are really close to the road, but it was a 200-foot change in elevation almost straight up to that location with a clear cut up on top and no parking area. So you actually had to come in from other areas to get into those spots. Not very common access. Was close to a road, but it's hidden from the road completely. And so you're looking for those hidden pockets that contain it all, and certainly have been devoid of hunting pressure for a long time, with the thought that any applied hunting pressure is going to push deer away. And by the time you have a lot of hunting pressure around from different angles, there are going to be very few pockets that not only are hidden from hunting pressure, but that actually contain the ingredients for solid late season cover and food. It's very important that you ignore the really good deerless areas. So areas that you have fond memories of hunting in October when they were hitting some acorns, or in November during the rut, these deer were in there and you know they're in there. Sometimes we fall into that trap of hitting it over and over and over again, those same stands, thinking that something's going to happen soon. And it's easy to do. We have a good history in that area, but you have to ignore those spots. If there's no deer sign, no current rubs, no fresh scrapes or rubs for a second or a third rut, no tracks, no pellet counts, fresh tracks, then move on to the next spot. You haven't found the spot that you need to sit. Because when you find a late season hot spot on public land or private, it's going to have a lot of sign, a lot of tracks, because again, there's a lot of deer there. You can't help but notice them there. If you're really having a hard time finding sign, ignore it and move on, even if it's a favorite spot. And this is a time of year where it's really going to help you scout for next year too. So forcing you to get out of your comfort level. I have people all the time on public land, they say, well, I don't see deer. Well, move. If you never see deer in a spot, you haven't seen a deer all season, why are you hunting there? You know, it's pretty cool to have a spot. I've fallen trap into areas where I like the area, I like the access, and you think there should be deer there and there's not, and you hunt it thinking there maybe some old rubs, whatever it is. But you have to have more of a short memory and almost a lack of patience when it comes to finding good areas in the late season and making sure you change. And that can apply to the entire season when it comes to public land. No deer, move. There's got to be a better spot within an hour of home somewhere that you can get on public land. Stay mobile. So critical. Ignore this spot. Instead of moving over a half mile or a mile and looking deeper into the woods thinking you're going to find deer, if you're just not seeing any sign of deer, just hop in the car, move to another spot. It's a lot better to chip around. And that's a public land suggestion anyways. If you're really looking for sign, even if you're looking for sign in the off season and you're scouting during the summertime, really take the time to be mobile and just really hop around and look for those concentrations of sign, historical sign if it's during the summertime, and then current sign if it's late season and you're scouting right now. And what I do is I go into that with an attitude when I'm being mobile, that I've walked to areas where I walk very slow. You start seeing sign. You don't want to fall that trap of getting into the middle of the sign and spooking deer. You find that edge, you find a transition, a funnel, a habitat change line, and then you hunt in that location with the thought that you're just hitting the edge, maybe even go around to the side in another access point along a swamp line or up a steep ridge, and you get to the edge where you think those deer are with the different wind combination. Be very wary of actually getting into the middle of sign, spooking deer, and ruining your hunt before it begins. Really get to the edge where the concentration of sign is, movements, and set up shop with your wind blowing out of that location. But stay mobile, very critical. And then of course bait. You know, that's kind of on you. I'm not going to ever say that baiting's a great thing or a bad thing. That's kind of your personal decision of what you want to hunt. But boy, I've seen some great locations in Michigan, Ohio private land, North Dakota. There's states out there where you can hunt, you can bait on public land, and they can be hot spots in the late season. Not saying you have to go out and bait, but if you want to, it can offer some great opportunities. And when you are in public land locations during the late season and you find concentrations of deer and they have a lack of quality food, then offering some bait can be pretty tempting as far as giving yourself an ability to actually see pretty big deer numbers that are coming in. And Ohio can't bait on public land, but you can certainly use bait on private land to your advantage that time of year. I know a lot of locations where people are baiting behind their backyard. Maybe they have 40 acres, they have a big bait pile back there on private land, and then it butts up to tens of thousands of acres of public. Probably won't give you permission to actually go through their yard and get back in the public land, but there's always a way in to the back of that location, and that could be some of the best hunting. I know some really good spots where people are actually hunting bait on private land, but they're a quarter mile back on the public land in that location, in that sweet spot where the bucks and does are actually coming back to bed. And always remember, those does are going to bed closer to that bait. So when you start getting back a quarter mile, half mile on public land, and you're coming in from the opposite direction, really look for good quality buck sign, slip in there in the morning and wait for those deer to come back to you. Again, that's on you, your decision whether you want to bait or not, or if that's something you want to do, but it can give you some great late season opportunities in a state that allows you to. I wasn't able to hunt Pennsylvania public land during gun season. I went out with the Hunting Public and Public Land Challenge middle of October, and I just didn't feel like traveling much. I like being home as much as I can. We already have enough tags in Wisconsin, Minnesota, and but I really think about going back to public land and some of my haunts back there, and you notice that deer really start to herd up. They're in great numbers. And I think about some of those stands of hemlocks that are actually pretty remote, and you can get into them. They're next to areas that have good hardwood habitat diversity, a little bit higher stem count. They're lower. A lot of times you find in those elevated locations where there's a lot of topography, the deer are getting off the tops and they're down in the valleys. And so I won't have time to go back to Pennsylvania this year, but they have the late muzzleloader hunt and different opportunities. And it's, I really think about some of those spots, think, man, I could slip in there and this might be a good spot to hunt. There's some really good hunting on public land, private land this time of year. Follow the 2% rule. Stay mobile, look for it, look for good hardwood regeneration during the day, look for areas where they have some thermal protection, high stem count, and you're gonna find really concentrated hot spots of whitetails that could be a lot of fun to hunt this time of year. I know a lot of my friends are onto ice fishing right now and doing other things, but for me it's whitetails all the time when the season ends and I'm on client properties, and that's kind of my life, kind of dull and boring. I just like whitetails. So find it if you're still hunting this time of the year, find those hot spots, enjoy the hunting this time. And even these winds, we have great clothes that we can be protected from this late season and all the weather that can throw at it. And I think you can find, if you haven't tried it already, some really enjoyable times to hunt whitetails, even when the wind kicks up and the conditions turn harsh.
Now, as we transition into habitat season, I hope you've had a chance to check out my web class, How to Design Your Whitetail Parcel. It's on my website, whitetailhabitatsolutions.com. I have a link in the description, and I hope you can find it, check it out, and enjoy it this year.